They say loneliness doesn't always come from being alone, it comes from being surrounded by the familiar and still feeling invisible. That's the kind of loneliness I'd grown accustomed to. My husband? A good man, hard-working, but his work was his first love, and somewhere along the way, I became the shadow that lingered in the background of his success. It wasn't always like this, but the years have a way of eroding things you thought were unshakable. You don't notice it at first, how the conversations grow shorter, the silences longer, the moments of connection fewer and further between. And before you know it, you're sitting in a house that feels too big and too quiet, wondering when your life became this small. That afternoon was no different. The hum of the fridge filled the silence, accompanied by the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. I sat in the living room, flipping through a magazine I had no interest in, more out of habit than anything else. My phone sat untouched on the table, the screen dark, no messages, no calls. I told myself I was used to it. After all, my husband was always away, business trips, meetings, late nights at the office. That was our life, or at least, it was mine. But deep down, I felt the weight of it. The monotony. The stillness. The creeping realization that I had somehow become a supporting character in my own story. I loved my husband, or at least, I loved the version of him I married. But now? Now, I wasn't so sure. Somewhere along the line, passion had faded into routine, and routine had hardened into something far lonelier than I was willing to admit. I was lost in these thoughts when I heard it, the sharp sound of a car door closing. It startled me, pulling me out of my spiral of reflection. I glanced out the window, and there he was, Alex, my nephew, striding up the path to the front door with that effortless confidence he always carried. It had been months since I'd seen him, but his presence was the kind that left an impression long after he was gone. I didn't know what brought him here that day, but what I didn't realize was that his arrival would change everything. As I watched him approach, I felt a mix of curiosity and relief. The silence I'd been drowning in all day was about to be broken, and for the first time in hours, maybe even days, I felt something other than emptiness. I didn't know it then, but that knock on the door wasn't just the start of a visit, it was the start of a moment I'd never be able to forget. The knock at the door was firm, deliberate. I stood, smoothing down my shirt as I made my way to answer it, the quiet anticipation tugging at me. When I opened the door, there he was, Alex, my husband's nephew. His face broke into a wide, confident grin as soon as he saw me, and I couldn't help but mirror it. There was something about his energy that was disarming, effortless, like he carried the world lightly on his shoulders. "Aunt Emma." He greeted warmly, stepping forward as though we'd seen each other just yesterday. "Uncle asked me to swing by and pick up some documents he left behind." His tone was casual, his demeanor easygoing, yet there was a spark of liveliness about him that instantly filled the doorway. "Alex, what a surprise," I said, genuinely taken aback but trying not to show it too much. Come in, come in. It's been ages since I've seen you." I stepped aside, letting him enter, and suddenly the quiet house didn't feel so stifling anymore. His presence had a way of filling the space, making it feel alive in a way it hadn't in far too long. As he stepped inside, he looked around, his eyes roaming over the familiar furnishings. "I always love coming here," he said with an approving nod. "You've got great taste, Aunt Emma. The place feels timeless." His compliment caught me off guard, and I laughed softly, brushing it off. "Flattery already, Alex?" "You just walked in the door," I teased, trying to hide the faint blush that crept up my neck. "It's not flattery if it's true," he shot back with a playful grin, dropping his bag onto the couch and stretching his arms casually. There was something about the way he carried himself, confident, but not arrogant, that made the room feel lighter, warmer. I found myself relaxing without even realizing it, drawn into the ease of his presence. "What kind of documents are you looking for?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation back to business. He shrugged, his movements relaxed, almost careless. "Something about property papers." He didn't give me much detail, just said to swing by and grab them. He started toward the study, his steps unhurried, and I followed behind him, my curiosity piqued by how effortlessly he moved through the house, like he belonged there. As he searched for the papers, I couldn't help but notice how different he was from his uncle, my husband. Alex was spontaneous, magnetic, the kind of person who drew others in without trying. My husband, on the other hand, was measured, reserved, always preoccupied. The contrast was stark, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name as I watched Alex leaf through the papers with an air of casual competence. "Got them?" he said, holding up a small stack of documents with a triumphant smile. "Uncle will be relieved." He returned to the living room, dropping onto the couch with an easy grace that made me smile despite myself. "You know," he said, leaning back, "I don't know how you keep this place looking so perfect. It's impressive." "Well, someone has to," I replied with a laugh, though I could feel a flicker of something deeper beneath the surface. His words, his presence, it all felt so refreshing. For the first time in what felt like forever, the house didn't feel so lonely, and I didn't feel quite so invisible. And just like that, the quiet, solitary afternoon I'd expected had taken on a life of its own, one I hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely prepared for. Alex returned from the study, the documents in hand, but instead of heading straight for the door, he casually dropped them onto the coffee table and settled back into the couch like he had all the time in the world. "So, Aunt Emma," he began, his tone light, "how have you been? It's been ages since we had a proper catch-up." He leaned back, his relaxed posture inviting me into the kind of easy conversation I hadn't had in far too long. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to say. "Oh, you know, the usual," I replied, my voice a little too breezy. "Keeping busy, managing the house, nothing too exciting." But Alex wasn't satisfied with that answer. He tilted his head, a playful glint in his eye. "Come on, you've got to give me more than that. Surely there's something interesting going on?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Not much changes around here, Alex. Your uncle's always traveling, and I'm just here." The words came out more honestly than I intended, but Alex didn't seem to judge. Instead, he smiled warmly. "Well, you're doing an amazing job of keeping the place together. It's like stepping into one of those designer homes." I rolled my eyes at the compliment, but I couldn't help the smile that tugged at my lips. There was something about the way he spoke, his tone so genuine, his energy so infectious, that made it impossible to feel self-conscious or guarded. "Enough about me," I said, waving a hand. "What about you? What have you been up to these days?" That was all the invitation Alex needed. He launched into a series of stories that were equal parts hilarious and adventurous. He talked about his latest road trip with friends, the mishap they'd had with a flat tire in the middle of nowhere, and the impromptu camping experience that followed. He shared anecdotes about work, about the people he met and the challenges he faced, weaving each tale with humor and charisma that made me laugh more than I had in weeks. I found myself leaning forward, completely absorbed in his words. It wasn't just the stories themselves, it was the way he told them, the animation in his voice, the sparkle in his eyes. It was refreshing, a stark contrast to the quiet, predictable routine I'd grown accustomed to. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about my responsibilities, my husband's absence, or the lingering loneliness that usually hovered in the back of my mind. In that moment, it was just Alex and me, two people sharing laughter and connection. At one point, Alex threw his head back and laughed, the sound so genuine and full of life that I couldn't help but join in. "You have a way of making everything sound like an adventure," I said, still smiling. He shrugged with a grin. "Life's too short not to find the fun in it, right?" His words struck a chord with me, and I nodded, suddenly aware of how much I'd been missing moments like this, moments of warmth, of spontaneity, of being fully present. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and as the minutes ticked by, the house felt different, less like a silent, empty space and more like a home filled with life. Alex's presence was magnetic, his enthusiasm contagious, and for a little while, I forgot about everything else. I forgot about the silence that usually filled my days, about the heaviness that had settled over my heart. In that moment, I felt lighter, freer, and more alive than I had in a long time. The conversation was light and easy, but there was a moment when everything seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly. Alex leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his full attention locked on me as I spoke. It wasn't the casual kind of interest you'd expect, it was focused, intense, like every word I said mattered. I felt myself falter slightly, the unexpected weight of his gaze catching me off guard. I reached for the glass of water on the coffee table, my hand brushing against his as he reached for the same glass. The touch was fleeting, but it lingered in my mind longer than it should have. It was such a small thing, but it felt different. I quickly pulled my hand back, laughing nervously to mask the heat rising in my cheeks. "Sorry about that," I muttered, avoiding his eyes. Alex simply smiled, his expression unreadable but disarming all the same. The room suddenly felt too warm, the air heavier than before. I stood abruptly, needing a moment to clear my head. "I'll grab something from the kitchen," I said quickly, walking away before he could respond. As I moved into the kitchen, I busied myself with tasks that didn't need doing, straightening an already clean counter, opening and closing a cabinet aimlessly. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of Alex's presence. It lingered, filling the room even though he wasn't standing there. I turned back toward the doorway, and there he was, leaning against the frame with that same effortless confidence that seemed to follow him everywhere. His arms were crossed, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You seem different today," he said, his voice soft but deliberate. The comment startled me, and I froze, unsure of how to respond. "Different?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed me with its slight tremor. Alex nodded, his gaze steady. "Yeah, different. More alive, I guess. There's just something about you today." His words hung in the air, and I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name, flattered, uneasy, and undeniably self-conscious. There was a sincerity in his tone that made it impossible to dismiss as mere flattery, and that scared me more than anything. "Alex," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to me. "You're imagining things." I turned back to the counter, trying to busy myself again, but his words echoed in my mind, refusing to let me focus. After a long pause, I finally turned to face him. "You should probably go now," I said quietly, avoiding his eyes. I didn't sound convincing, not to him, not to myself. Alex didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, his tone soft yet steady as he asked, "Am I making you uncomfortable?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the situation with the boundaries I knew I needed to uphold. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. "Emma," he said, his voice almost a whisper now. "If I'm crossing a line, just tell me, and I'll stop." His hand reached out slowly, brushing against mine, and the air between us felt charged, heavy with emotions neither of us had spoken aloud. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, torn between stepping back and staying rooted in place. Just as the tension reached its peak, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. The sound jolted us both, and I stepped back quickly, my hand pulling away from his as if burned. We turned toward the living room to see Mia, my niece, standing in the doorway. Her expression was a mix of confusion and suspicion as she glanced between me and Alex, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Aunt Emma," she said slowly, her tone laced with curiosity. "Uncle sent me to pick up some papers. He said Alex might be here, but I didn't expect this." Her gaze lingered on the two of us, and I could feel the blood rushing to my face. I forced a smile, trying to steady my voice. "Oh, yes," I said quickly. Alex was just grabbing the documents, and we got caught up chatting. "He has them already." Mia raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Funny," she said, her tone pointed. "He didn't mention you'd be here too, Alex." Her words cut through the air like a knife, and the tension in the room was palpable. Alex, ever composed, shrugged with a casual grin. Didn't think it mattered, he said lightly. We were just catching up. The words seemed harmless on the surface, but their weight wasn't lost on Mia, or on me. She looked at me for a moment longer, her gaze searching, before finally stepping back toward the door. Well, she said, her tone clipped, I'll leave you two to, whatever this is. With that, she turned and walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. Alex turned to me, his expression unreadable, and I could feel the shame and confusion settling over me like a heavy blanket. I couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes, the weight of the moment too much to bear. All I could do was stand there, wondering how we had gotten here, and how we could possibly move forward. Alex, ever composed, broke the silence with a chuckle that seemed far too casual for the charged atmosphere. Well, that was unexpected, he said lightly, his grin effortless as he picked up the stack of documents from the table. He turned toward Mia, his tone smooth and easy. Guess Uncle sent you as backup in case I messed this up. His words were playful, but they didn't entirely mask the tension in his voice. Mia didn't smile. Her gaze darted between the two of us, her expression skeptical. Backup or not, she said, her tone clipped, he didn't mention you'd be here this long. Her words hung in the air, pointed and deliberate, and I felt the weight of her suspicion settle heavily in the room. I tried to respond, to diffuse the situation, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. We were just catching up, Alex said smoothly, his grin unwavering. You know how Aunt Emma always has the best stories. He shot me a quick glance, his expression calm, but I could see the flicker of something behind his eyes, an unspoken message, a plea to follow his lead. I nodded quickly, forcing a laugh that felt hollow. Yes, just catching up, I echoed, though the words sounded weak even to me. Mia didn't respond immediately, her gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than was comfortable. Finally, she shrugged, her tone still sharp as she said, well, I've got what I need. I'll let you two get back to, whatever this was. Her words stung, the implication cutting deeper than I cared to admit. She turned and walked toward the door, leaving it slightly ajar as she exited. The sound of her car door slamming echoed in the stillness that followed, and the tension in the room seemed to thicken in her absence. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Alex stood there, the documents in his hand, his expression unreadable. His usual confidence seemed to waver slightly, and for the first time that afternoon, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. I couldn't meet his gaze. Shame and regret coursed through me, the weight of what had nearly happened crashing down like a tidal wave. Emma, he began softly, his tone careful, almost hesitant. But I shook my head, cutting him off, before he could say more. Alex, you should go, I said quietly, my voice trembling. I couldn't bring myself to look at him, couldn't face the emotion swirling in his eyes. He hesitated for a moment, as though he wanted to say something else, but then he nodded, turning toward the door. As the door clicked shut behind him, I sank onto the couch, my hands trembling as I buried my face in them. The events of the day replayed in my mind, every glance, every touch, every word. How had I let things get this far? How had I allowed myself to come so close to crossing a line I'd always sworn I'd never approach? The silence in the house felt suffocating now, and the weight of my own thoughts was unbearable. That day challenged everything I thought I knew about myself, my relationships, and the boundaries we live by. It forced me to confront the cracks in my marriage, the loneliness I'd buried for so long, and the dangerous allure of connection in unexpected places. It left me questioning where we draw the line between comfort and connection, and how we move forward when those lines blur. This isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a complicated journey I never thought I'd have to take. If you want to hear what happens next, let me know in the comments. Because the choices we make in moments like these can change everything, and I'm still figuring out what that means for me.